This is Jamie Dyer welcoming you to another edition of the Quo-Cast. And I'm joined by Chris, who joins me via Zoom. Welcome to the podcast, Chris. Tell me, how did you get into Status Quo?
Hi, Jamie. Hi, everybody. Well, I remember very clearly my first encounter with Status Quo. It was a Thursday night in 1972. I was 9 years old, and like every other 9-year-old in the country, I was watching Top of the Pops because there was literally nothing else to do in those days. And there was the usual stream of glam rock acts who were the sort of staples of those times, and all with their spangly guitars and their ridiculous Baco foil costumes. And then suddenly this band came on, and the thing that struck me, the first thing that struck me about the Quo was that they were playing with their backs to the camera. They're facing each other. They were facing the drummer, and this was these guys have got attitude. I remember thinking, you don't do that on telly. This is quite something, and the state of those blokes. I mean, with the scruffy jeans and everything, and they were very much sort of anti-glam, I guess you would say, and the racket they were making, it was great. I mean, it wasn't a million miles away from what I'd got into with like Slade and Sweet and the bands that were doing it there. It was the same kind of, sort of slightly heavy sound, but that insistent boogie beat, it really got to me. And there's just the power and the velocity of the whole thing. And of course, they were playing Paper Plane, which was their first kind of hit of that sort of era. And that was it. And I've been a fan ever since.
So between there, what was the first album that you bought? Would that have been Piledriver?
I think it was. Yes, it was a few years late because I only bought singles when I was a kid. But yes, I remember buying Piledriver. I mean, you take one look at the cover of Piledriver and you think, yes, I have to own this album, because that iconic sort of image of the three of them with their hair flying all over the shop. It just says everything about what we all love about Status Quo. And I think that was my first album, and others were, of course, to follow.
So again, how long between that and your first gig?
Well, I didn't actually see the Quo until 1984. I saw, and I think that was because they never seemed to play in Bristol, which is sort of my hometown. And I don't know, I've never actually had this definitely verified, but I believe that Status Quo got banned from playing at the Colston Hall, which is the main sort of concert hall in Bristol, because clearly they apparently they did a gig there somewhere in the mid 70s, and the fans got a bit over enthusiastic and started chucking chairs around and stuff. And the concert hall manager sort of banned them and said, you're not playing here again, you long-haired scruffs, or words to that effect. I don't know whether that's true, but that's what somebody once told me. And it's certainly the case that I never saw Status Quo in Bristol. I saw lots of other bands during my teenage years. With my mate Andy, we used to go and see loads of bands, but I didn't actually catch up with the Quo until 1984, and it was in Hanover in Germany. Because I was doing a languages degree by then, and I was doing part of my year abroad in Hanover. And so I saw them there. It was on the what was supposed to be the End of the Road tour. What I remember most about that gig was that about 1/3 of the audience were British squaddies, because there was a massive British army presence in Hanover and sort of northern Germany. This was like the height of the Cold War and everything. And they'd all got pass outs to go and see the Quo. And they stood out like sore thumbs because they all had military haircuts. And they were somewhat conspicuous amongst the rest of the audience, who sort of basically had hair down to their backsides. But it was a good gig, and I felt very pleased that I'd finally seen these guys in concert.
And I'm sure, like many, you thought, I'm not going to see these guys again, because, like you say, it was billed as the End of the Road tour.
Yes, I mean, I was never entirely sure what was going on. I mean, we now know that there was all sorts of trouble during that era, and cocaine was causing all sorts of problems, and I don't think I ever fully believed that the Quo would just stop, because what happens afterwards, and the following year they were playing at Live Aid. It was only later that I really kind of realized just how sort of touch and go and how close they were to basically knocking it on the head and doing something different. But the last time that I have seen them until now was a couple of years ago on I think it was called the Last of the Electrics tour. So I think there is an interesting. I don't think. So I've actually seen the same band play two separate farewell tours 33 years apart, which has to set some sort of record.
But that would have been with Richie Malone?
Yes. I think Rick was still on the planet at that point, but he sort of stepped back from the band. And Richie Malone was on rhythm and doing a fine job, as he has continued to do since joining the band a few years ago.
So let's talk albums. So you would have got Piledriver a few years later, because that was kind of your introduction to the band through Paper Plane. But a lot has been said about that sort of 72 to 76 period. Do you think that is perhaps the best as they consider it to be?
It's the era that I like best. I mean, it's the sort of the golden era of, heads down, no nonsense, boogie, Quo. Which, if you are a Quo fan, that is the point of Status Quo. I guess they kind of scratch that itch in a way that very few bands can do. But I think it's quite striking with a lot of Quo fans is that they. A lot of Quo fans would say, well, everything after Rocking All Over the World was a load of rubbish, and I can't be doing with that. And it is quite remarkable that so many people basically disregard about 45 years worth of a band's output. I think it's possibly unique to Status Quo. I mean, you don't tend to get Beatles fans say, they should have stuck with the 2-minute pop songs. Can't be doing with all this Strawberry Fields Forever nonsense. So it's a funny thing that a lot of Quo fans do. But I think the Quo have done some good music throughout their career, but you have to go back to the early 70s, and that was when they were defining themselves, I suppose. And it's certainly those 5 albums from Piledriver through to Blue for You and the live album. Yeah, they definitely count as my favorites.
I think, though, they a little bit like the Beatles, kind of continue to reinvent themselves in different ways. By the time you discovered them in 72, they'd already been a psychedelic pop outfit. I mean, what did you make of it when you first discovered that fact?
Well, it was a bizarre thing. I mean, I remember somebody at school playing me Pictures of Matchstick Men and saying, "Do you know who this band is?" And if it wasn't for the fact that I recognized Francis Rossi's quite distinctive vocal, I'd never have guessed. So it is true. I mean, they underwent this radical transformation, sort of like a metamorphosis, sort of in the early 70s, as they ditched all that psychedelic stuff and got into playing heavy boogie. And bands have to evolve to survive, and Quo have evolved quite subtly, one would say, because they're still very much recognizable from what they were doing in the early days. But it's just great that they're still going, because when I look back on my life, I'm 58 years old now, and only 2 things really have been constant throughout my life. One is the Queen, and the other is Status Quo, and they've just always been there, and it's kind of quite hard to imagine that one day they won't be.
But I can't believe I'm about to say this, but like the Queen, there's lots of legacy, lots of things to look back at.
Yes, there is. I mean, they've done so much in their career. When you think about the crazy stunts that they pulled, like the was it the Rock Till You Drop thing, where they played 4 gigs in 4 countries in 24 hours. I mean, that's just insane. I mean, I think they lost their way a little bit with all of the cover albums the albums of cover versions that they did in the 90s. That got a bit tedious. But I mean, they have they've become national treasures, I suppose, a bit like the Queen. And Rossi and Parfit sort of became a kind of almost a showbiz double act at one point. They were on TV the whole time, sort of doing their bad boy banter, and it always went down very well. And I think the Quo have reinvented themselves to the extent that they've needed to, but they've always kept that insistent sort of 12-bar thing in the background, which has sort of propelled them through. I think it's 33 albums they've released now in 50 years, which is an extraordinary record.
You touched upon something there. You mentioned the Rossi Parfit double act. Do you think that perhaps hurt their credibility a little bit?
Well, to some extent. I mean, I think that they went a bit showbiz at one point, and they were. I recall sort of seeing videos of them sort of popping up on various TV shows. I think they did a kids' TV show once where they were sort of had gunk chucked at them the whole time. They were playing Gert and Dula, which presumably was the only song they could think of they could play on acoustics, so that they didn't sort of electrocute themselves when buckets of water went over their guitars.
Yeah, that will be the Tis Was Reunited.
That's what it was.
Special from a few years ago. Yeah, it confused a lot of people.
yes. Tis was one of the great joys of growing up in the 70s. And I don't know whether they appeared on the original Tis Was. I wouldn't surprise me if they did.
They did actually. There's a great clip, I think, of Rick Parfit and Andy Bowen dressed as sunflowers, I think.
That's standard for Tis Was. I mean, I know Chris Tarrant was a huge rock fan, so he got a lot of the heavy bands on Tis Was, which was supposedly a kids show, but absolutely wasn't. Yeah, I mean, you talked about their credibility, and they did a series of commercials for a supermarket chain in Australia. Mangling down at one point of all songs, and I've never been to Australia, but I've seen the videos, and you sort of think, oh guys, why did you have to do that? But several $100,000 Australian dollars was probably the answer why they did it. So I like
the acoustic whatever you want advert from Coles supermarkets. That's also. Because the down one is the one everybody remembers, but they did a bunch of acoustic ones as well, which ended up becoming acoustic.
Well, that was the root of the acoustic, was it? That was what turned them onto it.
I'm sure that Francis mentioned that in an interview somewhere.
Right. And yeah, I really liked the acoustic stuff because I mean, I play a bit of guitar myself, and I like sort of arranging music, and it was fascinating to hear how they'd sort of taken their own stuff and reworked it for basically a different medium, and I think a lot of it worked surprisingly well. I mean, there are some songs like Burning Bridges I think actually work better with the sort of played as a kind of like a sort of a barn dance hoedown sort of thing. I think that they work particularly well in that style, possibly better than the original recording. And others, they just gave it a slightly different flavor, and there was an accordion on it and sort of female backing vocals, and I really like those recordings.
It did split a lot of people. I think it was quite controversial. I mean, the front cover was a little bit of a mixed reaction, and obviously the fact that the album was called Stripped Bare, and then there were more instruments on it than would normally be there.
That's true. I mean, splitting hairs, I would say on the instrumentation front, because it was different kinds of instruments, wasn't it? A lot of there's a fiddle there and an accordion. No, I liked it. And what was interesting was how so many of the songs on the two acoustic albums came from the early 70s albums, because a lot of people don't or have forgotten that albums like Piledriver and Hello have got some really good sort of quiet ballad songs that work quite well in the sort of stripped down approach. And even an album like Piledriver with the cover, and everybody thinks it's the epitome of, heads down, reckless boogie. There's actually some really, really nice, tender songs on that. A Year, a beautiful song, quite poignant song. Unspoken Words, sort of semi-acoustic blues, which I absolutely love, which I don't think they did on acoustic. But they've always had that element of writing really good melodies. And yeah, that's why Status Quo have been such a massively successful band, is because they've written songs or melodies that people can hum. Even Caroline, which is classic sort of heads down rock. It's got that chorus, "Come on, sweet Caroline." People can sing along with that in the pub. So there are many parts to Status Quo, and there are many secrets to how they've been as successful as they are, I feel.
And the acoustic albums gave them an opportunity to exploit that. I mean, I think the funniest comment I saw for Acoustic 2 was when That's a Fact came out, and someone accused them of plagiarizing George Michael because of the rhythm.
Yes.
And it's like, but if you go back to the original That's a Fact from the Blue for You album, it has that rhythm. It's just a lot more kind of overblown. It's much bigger.
Yes. And I think we should all ask ourselves, was George Michael a closet Quo fan? I don't know what the answer to that is. But yeah, I mean, music comes around and people pick up influences from all over the shop, don't they? And if it hadn't been for Chuck Berry, Status Quo would never have existed. That's their that's their sort of closest living relative, I suppose, in terms of the musical taxonomy of where they come from. And of course, they covered quite a few Chuck Berry songs over the years, notably "Bye Bye Johnny," of course, on
the On the Level album,
on the Level and the live album. Although my favourite Chuck Berry cover that they did was "Carol."
I knew you were going to say that.
Never Too Late, because it's just heads down, let's go for it. And I absolutely love that cover.
And then you find out that it was recorded in Rick Parfitt's games room or something, which makes it even better somehow. It somehow just feels like a jam.
Yes. Well, at the start, you've got them going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, and and sometimes bands sort of put that in to kind of make it sound a bit more kind of homespun, and it's all a little bit unauthentic. But I can quite believe that, they've possibly been on the beer a little bit and said, "Hey, let's record a Chuck Berry cover," and away they went. And it has that kind of authenticity about it. That kind of, let's not overcomplicate things. Let's just turn it up to 11 and go for it.
I mean, the chances are, if they hadn't have recorded it in 81, they may have done it on one of the covers albums, because I think it was a favourite.
Yes. There were an awful lot of songs did get the treatment, didn't they, during those cover version albums in the 90s. Some very surprising covers. I mean, the When You Walk in the Room, for example, was one of them. The sort of with a classic sort of 60s pop tune, and they were very good at taking material that you wouldn't think would work in a Status Quo context and just giving it that little bit of Quo edge. And because they were such good musicians and such sort of crafters of melody, they could get away with it.
The one that comes to mind is Safety Dance. I mean, that was a bizarre choice, but somehow it works for me.
Yes. And I mean, of the most unlikely cover versions they ever did, probably In the Army Now would probably sort of rank, because it's a very unquo kind of song, but it was one of their biggest hits. And it was, I mean, it's got that wonderful kind of hook of "Whoa, whoa, you're in the army," which everyone can sing along with. But that was really good. And of course, that was the first record they released after the sort of the mid 80s kind of collapse of the band, and Alan Lancaster leaving and so on. We hadn't heard anything from Quo for quite a while, and are they still alive? Are they still going? And then suddenly they come up with this song, which is very different from everything that we thought Status Quo are all about, but it was a really good song and very well done. And I think it really gave the sort of the second incarnation of their career a big boost that they had made such a left field kind of choice of song and done it so well.
Do you think perhaps they should have stayed on that track that they were on within the Army now? Because it kind of felt a little bit like after that they were going sort of back to what they did before, but just with extra layers on it.
Yeah. Well, they could have done, but I think In the Army Now is a one-off. I mean, if they'd gone very much more along those lines, they would probably have changed their name and not been Status Quo anymore, because if there's no boogie going on, if there aren't any 12 bars in sight, then it just isn't Status Quo. In terms of commercial success, you have to say that they went the right way at most points. Not necessarily in terms of their credibility, but they didn't make too many left turns or right turns in their career which were big sort of commercial flops. So that's one of the reasons why they've kept going as long as they have.
Well, they have had a few commercial kind of failures, haven't they? Things that didn't quite go as perhaps they expected, like Perfect Remedy, for example. The deal they had in 1991 with Water Company that went bust or something. They had a song tied in with that then they still released as a single, even though, they changed the song around. Do you know which song that was?
No, I don't.
That was the re-recording of Can't Give You More.
Ah, right. Okay. It's highly educational coming to speak with you, Jamie, because your knowledge is more encyclopedic than my own, considerably more. But yeah, but I mean, of course, they've made a few false steps, but they've always bounced back. And reading the autobiography, the Excess All Areas book that Rick and Francis did, it was phenomenal how often Rick said, I was rolling in money and I had 10 Porsches in the garage, and then I shoved it all up my nose and I was broken. And then I got rich again, and it was just a sort of a roller coaster of success, and then problems. But the problems always seem to be overcome, and they were right back in the game before too long. They were fairly irrepressible Status Quo over their career.
I think perhaps what happened was they always tried to keep up. They always say, don't they, that they never keep up with trends. They just kept doing what they were doing. And it's like, yeah, but if you compare them perhaps with other bands from their era, they did keep up with certain things. You know what I mean?
Yes. I mean, they have updated their sound as they've gone along. I mean, the striking example of that was in the late 70s, in the sort of Rocking All Over the World, where they sort of suddenly produced a much slicker production, which wasn't to everybody's taste, but certainly updated their sound. And then on albums like We Can't Stand the Heat, they started introducing horn sections on some of the songs, which just gave the sound that little extra dimension. And I think they have been quite good at playing with just sort of innovating here and there to make themselves as relevant as you can be when you are Status Quo and you're ploughing a very, very particular furrow that your fans don't want you to leave too far behind.
So you mentioned there the sort of late 70s, the way that they changed their sounds with horns. I mean, what did you make of that change? I quite liked it. I thought I know their music often gets termed as pub rock. I felt that with the horns, it felt more like bar rock. Do you know what I mean? If that's a thing, right?
Yes, I know what you mean. Yeah. Well, I thought it was good, and I think those kind of late 70s, early 80s albums, that the Quo sort of found a style which really worked for them, commercially, certainly because they had some massive hits in that time, sort of Whatever You Want and so on. But they had the confidence to fall back on production techniques which they wouldn't have used on Piledriver or Quo or whatever. But they had the energy and they had the power behind the songs to make it work. Songs like Don't Drive My Car is not a typical Quo song, and the keyboards start to come through a bit more strongly, but it is unmistakably Status Quo. And, they for me, they managed to achieve the knack of just sort of broadening their sound without losing the momentum and the energy of what they had always stood for. And I mean, it all started going a little bit wrong with I think Back to Back wasn't their greatest album, but certainly that sort of late 70s, early 80s was a pretty strong phase for the Quo, even though that was the start of the problems with the personnel and the white powder.
Yeah. So, as a fan of the band, what album would you recommend to people? Like, what is the thing that you're spinning more often than others?
I think my all-time favorite album is probably Quo. I think it just works beautifully. It's just got some really strong songs on it, and it's got Slow Train, which is Quo's kind of hidden classic. I mean, it's just it's almost prog in the way that it changes direction and it has multiple parts to it, and the way it fits together. But it's just got that wonderful sort of jig with Rick and Francis sort of playing kind of harmony sort of guitar parts, and it's I absolutely love that song. I like it better than 4,500 Times, which is the big Quo fan favorite. But to me, that's a little bit sort of rambling. Slow Train is well constructed. It sort of doesn't outstay its welcome, and it's got a start, a middle, and a finish, and it's great. And it caps a really, really good album. So that is, I think the essence of the band. My all-time favorite Quo song is also my all-time favorite song by anybody at all, which is Caroline. Because I think that's just everything that I love about rock and roll, just distilled into 3 and a bit minutes of rock and roll wonderfulness. And I have given instructions for that song to be played at my funeral, quite loud at the end of the funeral. I quite like the idea of people walking out of the funeral, sort of massaging their ears and saying, actually, perhaps it's not such a bad thing he's gone. But no, I think that's definitely my all-time favorite.
Well, it's a very popular song and obviously a single, and the one of the shining lights of the Hello album. I mean, that was their first #1 album. Did you buy it?
I did, not at the time. I think I bought it in a second-hand record shop in Bristol when I was about 16. When I was sort of catching up on my back catalogue. But yes, that was yeah. I do remember buying it. I remember taking it home and discovering that the album version of Caroline has double the amount of opening riff than the single, the radio edit does for the single. So there's more Quo for your pound. Yeah, it's a great album. I love Hello. Really good.
Well, ironically, we're going to say goodbye because, well, we've come to about half an hour. But thank you, Chris. I realised we could talk about this for ages, and one of the reasons why I'm stopping is my computer is about to die. I use a desktop computer, and I'm sat. If I've been very quiet, it's because I've sat here while everything and my computer just shuts down slowly. So we should probably end it there. But thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Do you plan on seeing Quo again in the future?
I very much hope so. Yes, I hope so. I haven't got any definite plans, but when they sort of head our way next time, I'll certainly be looking at getting some tickets.
Because they do come to where you're not in Bristol, are you?
No, I now live in Kent, so it's basically an hour away from London. So that's where I see most of my bands these days. Although I did see them in Bedgebury Forest. The Quo played there about 10 years ago, and they did a fantastic gig on one of these forestry commission package tours, and that was one of the better Quo gigs that I've seen in the open air, surrounded by pine trees. It was rather good.
So, what was good about it?
It was the first time I'd seen them for quite a while, and the previous time I'd seen them was during the 90s, when they kind of went off the boil, and they did a very uninspiring gig in Brighton that I went to see, where their heart didn't seem to be in it. It was as though they were doing cover versions of their own songs. It was bizarre. And I had slight trepidation going back to see them again quite a few years later in Bedgebury Forest. But they got up and they were rocking, and it was great. And I was relieved to see that the old Status Quo, with the sort of the power, the energy, the sense of humor, it was all there. It all come back, and I thought, yeah, these guys have rediscovered it. Yeah, really good show, and well worth the hour and a half wait to get out of the car park afterwards.
Yeah, I think that happens at most shows, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Chris, for being on the podcast today.
Jamie, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.